Thank you, Madam President. I am really on the record opposing President Biden's decision to abruptly withdraw troops from Afghanistan. And I oppose it for the same reasons many of the world's most respected military officials oppose it. We knew our allies would suffer. The Taliban have burned their way through Afghanistan and staked a claim on much of the territory that we have now abandoned. We created a void and the Taliban walked right on in. And last week, we watched as another of our adversaries planted their own flag in Afghanistan. On Wednesday, the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs tweeted this picture from a meeting between Chinese Communist Party officials and the Taliban. That is correct. Wednesday of last week. They even went so far as to say they're hopeful that the Taliban will embrace a peaceful and more inclusive approach to governance. It was a nice piece of performance art from a government recently accused of genocide, but this is what the CCP does best: fill the void, throw up a diplomatic facade, and seize as much power as they possibly can seize as quickly as they can do it. Back home in Tennessee, we have felt the ripple effects of Beijing's creeping dominance. You know, when most people think of a foreign threat, they think of an army or a spy ring. But what we need to understand is that these threats are much more subtle. If you don't know what you're looking for, you'll end up missing it. Back in the mid-90s, when I was the executive director for the Tennessee Film, Entertainment, and Music Commission, we were already fighting a losing battle against Chinese intellectual property theft. Now, this might not seem like a matter of national security, but for the songwriters and producers and creators who fell victim to it, it was a matter of economic security. This theft made them vulnerable. It made multiple industries vulnerable in our state, including the auto industry, auto parts, aviation, water sports. They all started to feel the effects of a dishonest Chinese Communist Party, and therefore, it made our country's economy vulnerable. The same goes for those playing whack-a-mole with the pirates and counterfeiters selling stolen or outright fake merchandise. It's a serious vulnerability. Sometimes those vulnerabilities are more obvious, however. For example, when the novel coronavirus sent us into lockdown, we were finally able to draw attention to how much control Beijing has over healthcare in America. They have a stranglehold on our supply chains for active pharmaceutical ingredients and medical supplies. I introduced the SAMC Act last year with Senator Menendez. That legislation would protect those supply chains and bring production back to the U.S. This threat didn't spontaneously evolve. It's the result of 100 seemingly small vulnerabilities that our adversaries in Beijing have found a way to exploit. How did it happen? Well, it has a lot to do with their slow takeover of international organizations, namely the United Nations. Since 1971, the Chinese Communist Party has exploited hopes that membership in the UN would force them to behave like a normal country. But the reality of the situation is that Chinese diplomats control 4 out of 15 specialized UN agencies and many other subsidiary offices. Even more importantly, the CCP is flooding the UN with lower-level staff, which means they have strength in numbers that we do not have. They've seized far too much power for comfort. Since 2007, Chinese diplomats have led the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs, which means they've also controlled the direction of the UN's development programs. By 2015, they had gained enough influence to make development synonymous with Belt and Road Initiative projects, which, as we all know, are debt trap schemes for Beijing's leveraging against struggling nations. This is a debt trap scheme. In 2014, China placed a diplomat at the top of the International Telecommunications Union. Since then, the ITU has more or less been Beijing's mouthpiece. They promote Chinese companies, Chinese telecom standards, and of course support Beijing's attempts to monopolize communications infrastructure in countries stuck in debt traps. It's all connected. Since their admission to the UN, the CCP has practically achieved immunity from accountability for human rights violations. The NGO China has used for years to whitewash their barbaric treatment of Tibetans is now a UN-accredited organization. In 2018, when the U.S. withdrew from UNESCO, who was waiting in the wings to become the largest financial contributor to global education? You're right, it was China. They've used their stranglehold on the Department of Economic and Social Affairs to officially silence the Uyghur Muslims of Xinjiang. They used their status as members of the Human Rights Council as cover for horrendous human rights violations in Tibet, Inner Mongolia, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and on the mainland. In 2019, we confirmed whistleblower testimony that revealed the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights sent the names of activists critical of the Chinese Communist Party straight to Beijing. And last year, we watched the World Health Organization praise Beijing for lying to the world about the severity of a disease that would eventually cause a deadly global pandemic. Madam President, we're in damage control mode. By the end of 2021, the UN will hold 9 elections for heads of specialized agencies and 5 for major funds or programs. We control exactly none of these positions. Our task is twofold. First, we must fill these voids. We don't have a choice. But we must also inject accountability by holding ourselves accountable for the integrity of our own relations with the UN and foreign countries. Last week, I introduced the UN Transparency and Accountability Act, which will strengthen America's influence as a key UN member nation and expose the threat adversarial countries pose to international organizations. My colleague, Congressman Michael McCall from Texas, has companion legislation ready to go in the House, and there's no sane reason why we shouldn't see these bills come up for a vote sooner rather than later. We're going to find out exactly who these bad actors are. We're going to flood the UN with Americans to stop them, and we're going to account for every single penny we contribute to UN projects. And then we're going to make the reports on all that spending available to the American taxpayer who is footing the bill. No more hiding. The bottom line is that we can't win this war without brute force. There is no weapon that can neatly cut the strings Beijing is pulling. Ceding freedom has consequences. The ripple effect created in Geneva and Brussels and New York and Washington can and will destroy the lives of people half a world away. As effective as diplomacy can be, we're alone in this one. We are responsible for safeguarding our freedom. As President Reagan once said, freedom is always one generation away from extinction. It has to be fought for and defended by each generation. There's no kicking the can down the road. Once it's gone, it is gone. There's no better voice for human rights than the United States. And if we do not speak up, we give every other nation on the planet an excuse to stay silent also. No one will come to our rescue if our supply chains are compromised. No one will come to the rescue of Tennessee innovators and companies if their supply lines are compromised by the Communist Chinese. And no one else is going to make sure our children and grandchildren don't fall into one of Beijing's debt traps. Perhaps we should keep that in mind this week as we take up all 2,700 plus pages of the infrastructure package. If ever there was a time for restraint